Welcome back, my friends, to another episode of the Shema podcast and a Q&A. I'm greatly appreciative to those in the Shema podcast for the perplexed WhatsApp community for submitting these questions. If you want to submit questions for future Q&As, please click on the show notes link that'll allow you to join the group. I would love to hear your questions as well. I love doing this. It forces me to learn things that I had not known before. So I appreciate the exercise. So once again, I have a great group of individuals in the Shema Podcast studio with their questions ready to go. So gentlemen, let's begin. If you could introduce yourself, present your question, and God willing, I will be able to answer those questions fully.
Welcome to the Shema Podcast, the podcast for the perplexed, where Torah insights, intertwined through personal stories, as well as interviews with leading Torah scholars, demonstrate the empowering qualities of Torah and mitzvot. For more great Torah learning through Torch, the Torah Outreach Center of Houston, go to torchweb.org. Now to the show.
So who would like to go first?
This is Robert Downey Jr. Dan, thanks so much for taking my question, and I love the show. My question is, does the sense of smell have different spiritual qualities than the other senses?
Great question, Robert Downey Jr. You know, I had heard this many years ago from Rabbi Cohen, that the sense of smell is not influenced by the Yetzer Hara. And it actually intuitively makes sense. I read a story, I can't find where I came across this story, but it was about Rabbi Akiva, and there was a king that was trying to make a good impression on Rabbi Akiva and influence him. I forget the details around it, but the point here that I'm making will resonate just the same. So the king sends into Rabbi Akiva's room in order to appease him, a prostitute. And the king wanted to send the most beautiful prostitute he could to Rabbi Akiva. And when this prostitute comes into Rabbi Akiva's room, he's full of such revulsion that he starts throwing up. And the prostitute leaves the room and goes back to the king, tells him what happens. And the king says, well, we need to find even a more beautiful prostitute to send to Rabbi Akiva. And the same thing happens again. This prostitute comes in and he looks at her and just immediately starts throwing up. It happens a third time. The same thing occurs until finally the king comes to Rabbi Akiva and says, what is going on here? These are the most beautiful women in my kingdom. And what Rabbi Akiva explains is that all he saw was the essence of their soul and how repugnant it had become through their actions and the way they lived their life. His eyesight was not clouded by his Yetzer Hara. He saw their spiritual essence, and it revolted him and made him sick to his stomach. What the king saw was very beautiful women. However, I am sure if someone had held up a soiled baby's diaper to both the king and Rabbi Akiva, they would both agree it did not smell good. And if they held up a bouquet of flowers, both the king and Rabbi Akiva would agree once again that those flowers smelled very nice. So you can sort of see that when it comes to sight, touch, and even hearing, like, you know, someone may want to speak some Lashon Hara and say, I heard something really juicy about someone. The Yetzer Hara will entice someone to say, that sounds great, let's listen. Someone who's on a proper level that has defeated their Yetzer Hara in this area would be repulsed by wanting to hear any Lashon Hara about another individual. I never knew the source of this, but is actually, after researching it, right in Bereshit, in Genesis, where the Torah is describing Hava's experience when she was tempted by the serpent to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the verse says, and the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable for gaining wisdom. So she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. And Chazal analyzes first and note that it explicitly describes the involvement of three senses. And it says, and the woman saw that the tree was good for food. So that's referring to sight. She took of its fruit, refers to touch, and she ate, referring to taste. However, there's no mention of smell in this description. And from this omission, various commentators infer that the sense of smell was not tainted by the Yetzer Hara during the sin. This idea was brought out by the Arizal, who explains that since smell was not involved in the sin, it remains the most spiritually elevated of the senses, uncorrupted by impurity. In the Gemara in Barachos 43b, it teaches what is something from which the soul benefits, but not the body. This is smell. This means that whereas the other senses, taste, sight, touch, and hearing, are deeply tied to physical enjoyment, the pleasure of smell is unique in that it primarily affects the neshama. The Maharal explains that smell is the most refined of the senses because it is the least physical. It is an intangible pleasure, unlike food, which is consumed, music, which is heard and processed, or touch, which involves direct contact. And this is why in the Havdalah ceremony at the conclusion of Shabbos, we smell the spices. Because the Gemara states that a Jew receives an extra soul on Shabbos. And when Shabbos departs, the soul experiences a sense of loss. And the act of smelling these beautiful spices is meant to revive it and comfort it. So since the sense of smell is uniquely connected to the soul and was not affected by the original sin, it retains a special level of kedusha, of holiness. Furthermore, in the Gemara in Sanhedrin explains that Mashiach will possess a supernatural ability to judge people through his sense of smell, and that he will perceive truth and falsehood without needing physical evidence or witnesses. Rashi explains that Mashiach will have a refined spiritual sensitivity, allowing him to discern a person's inner essence simply by smelling them, meaning he will sense their sincerity and righteousness without external proof. The Radak elaborates that this means Mashiach's judgments will be purely based on divine wisdom rather than conventional human perception. I've also read that Mashiach, because of this ability, will be able to discern who is actually Jewish and who is not Jewish. As there is a lot of confusion in the world today, there's many people out there who are Jewish and don't know they're Jewish. And there's some people, unfortunately, because of improper conversions, that believe they're Jewish but aren't actually Jewish. So he will be able to bring total clarity to this subject for us. So that was a great question. I really appreciated Robert Downey Jr. being able to answer that question for you.
That answer smells right. Your listeners should know that when the Jewish people learn their Torah and do mitzvos, that they are the true Iron Man.
I 100% agree with that. Okay, who is next?
Dan, thanks for having me on the show and taking my question. This is Keanu Reeves. Why does the Torah emphasize the physical traits of certain figures, such as height, beauty, or age? And what lessons can we learn from these details?
Keanu Reeves, thank you so much for that question. There's obviously something much deeper here that the Torah is there to convey. There is much written in the Midrash that details these physical attributes. I have read from Maimonides that when it comes to Midrash, he says that if someone does not believe that the Midrash have any truth or factual bearing to them, then they are an absolute heretic. But he goes on to say, if someone believes that every Midrash they read is 100% factual, then they are a religious fool. And he goes on to explain that the Midrash are all truth, but there are some things that are portrayed that are not factual, but there to teach us deeper lessons. I want to begin with the character in the Torah, Og, a giant. And I think this is a good starting place. So in Bereshit, it says, the Nephilim, which means fallen ones, were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God would consort with the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. They were the mighty ones of old, the men of renown. And Chazal explained that the sons of God were a group of angels who desired during the times of Noah to descend to earth and live as human beings. They were looking at mankind and they were thinking, what an absolute disaster they turn out to be. And the Midrash explains that these two angels requested permission from Hashem to descend, arguing that they would serve Hashem better than mankind. But once on earth, they were ensnared by material temptations and fathered children. These offspring were the Nephilim, giants of great strength and weakness. And Og is one of these descendants. So in this case, they were in fact giants in physical form, but through their acts, they used their power for corruption, tyranny, and immorality. So on a spiritual level, they were of small status, but they had this physical strength. And so there's several key Torah principles here. One is that physical greatness does not equal spiritual greatness. A lot of people look up to people with a tall, strong physical stature. And the Torah is warning us to look beyond that. The other very important lesson being taught here is that the angels looked at mankind and said, what a bunch of losers. We would never have done that. And they passed judgment on them. So Hashem put them in the exact situation and showed them and the other angels that they failed miserably. So the angels would understand not to judge mankind because the angels do not know what it's like to be in a physical body and have a Yetzer Hara. Now, with regard to judging others, I think this is a little bit of a tangent, but also interesting on that idea, is in Genesis when it talks about Hanok. In all the days of Hanok were 365 years, and Hanok walked with God, and he was no longer, for God had taken him. And like all the other figures in the genealogy of Adam, where the phrase, and he died, is used, Hanok's death is not explicitly mentioned. And instead, the Torah says he was no longer, for God took him. And so in the Midrash, it states that Hanok did not die, but he was transformed into the angel, which I was told by Rabbi Cohen, don't say the name of the angel. It doesn't matter whether it's a good angel, bad angel. Problem is when you state the name of an angel, you draw them near you. And if you don't have a specific reason why you're drawing them near you, it can create problems. That's all I know. So I never say the name of an angel. So like with this angel, we abbreviate the name as Meta. And so Hanok became Meta. And who was Meta? He is described as the highest of the angels, sometimes called the Prince of the Divine Presence. He is said to act as an intermediary between Hashem and humanity, recording deeds and sometimes judging souls. The Zohar further states that Meta was granted an almost human-like role in heaven because, why? Because he uniquely understood human struggles. Since he had lived in a physical body before becoming an angel, he could empathize with mankind's struggles, with the Yetzer Hara, unlike other angels who never had that experience. So this whole idea of judging others is you can't judge another person because you don't know all their experiences they went through and their unique situation. The angels judged us. They have no idea. And Hashem wanted to show the angels not to do that. And so who was a fitting person to become this angel? Someone that lived as a man, because Meta can empathize with us because he experienced all the struggles that we go through in this world. But let's go further. The Midrash states that Moshe was 10 amos tall, which is about 15 feet, which is obviously far beyond normal human height. So what does it mean? The Midrash also goes on to say that Paro was only 1 amma, which is about 1.5 feet tall. Again, highly exaggerated. What does this mean? Was Moshe really 15 feet tall and Paro 1.5 feet tall? And the answer is no, not in physical form. It's referring to Moshe's spiritual greatness and Paro's spiritual smallness. And even though power ruled over the greatest empire of the time, this teaches that earthly power is deceptive. One can seem powerful, but be totally insignificant in Hashem's eyes. So when physical traits are mentioned, it is typically a metaphor for spiritual greatness or spiritual corruption. The Torah mentions the great beauty of the matriarchs and Esther. And while their physical beauty may be totally true, the Torah is never just trying to convey what their appearance was like, but it represents their inner qualities. It reflects their spiritual beauty. Plus, having physical beauty comes with challenges. Sarah's beauty reflected her spiritual greatness. The Zohar says that her external beauty was a physical expression of her internal holiness. But that beauty also was a test, as she was taken twice when she was traveling with Avraham, showing that beauty can bring danger. Rivka is described as a very beautiful young woman, a virgin, and no man had known her. Her beauty is linked to purity and righteousness, and that despite her beauty, she remained untouched, suggesting a unique ability to maintain spiritual greatness in a corrupt world. And similar things are said of Rachel. Esther, her beauty was not a blessing, but a burden. It led her into the palace of King Ahasuerus. However, in the end, it became a vehicle for saving the Jewish people. The Midrash says that Esther actually lost her beauty when she was taken to the palace, but Hashem made her appear beautiful to King Ahasuerus when needed. All this is teaching is that beauty is not an independent virtue. Hashem controls its impact, and that her true greatness was not in her looks, but in her courage and faith. Like it says in Proverbs, when it comes to women, charm is false, beauty is vain, but a woman who fears Hashem, she shall be praised. And like we say in our davening in the morning, in Psalm 147, the strength of the horse he does not desire and finds no favor in the legs of man. Hashem favors those who fear him, those who hope for his kindness. So what matters, and what is real beauty, is having fear of Hashem. Why is fear mentioned both in Proverbs regarding women and in Psalms regarding men? It's because fear of heaven, fear of Hashem is what allows us to be humble, allows us to be vessels to serve Hashem. And that is what creates real beauty in the world. And another way we can know this to be true is that we know Hashem has no physical form. Obviously, to think that is heretical. However, you hear so many passages in Torah describing things like in Shemos where it says, I will bring you out from under the burdens of Egypt with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. Obviously, he doesn't have a physical arm. The arm is a metaphor for the way he will interact with us. And it says then, but Pharaoh will not heed you, and I will lay my hand upon Egypt. Obviously, Hashem does not need a hand to enact judgment on Egypt, but it's metaphorical. There's another verse that says, and the eyes of Hashem roam throughout the earth to strengthen those who are wholehearted toward him. So again, Hashem does not have arms and eyes, but this is all just metaphorical in how we should interpret these things to find much deeper truths when physical characteristics are conveyed in the Torah. Great question.
Dan, thanks for answering that question for me and encouraging Jews to take the red pill of Torah so they can escape from the matrix.
Thank you, Keanu. I couldn't agree more. Look, that is the goal here. The Torah is the red pill. It is what frees the mind of the Jew. Who has the next question?
Hello, Dan. Arnold Schwarzenegger here. I'm a longtime listener and appreciate you taking my question. Is there a unifying theme behind the stories in the Torah involving clothing, such as Yaakov and Yosef's coat, Esau and Nimrod's coat, or King David cutting Shaul's robe?
Arnold, fantastic question. I love this. Let's delve into it. We need to first begin with clothing itself, as it was not part of the original version of creation, or at least the clothing as we know it today. So we know, reading Bereshit, that Adam and Chava did not have clothing. They had no sense of being self-conscious. They had no ego, aka Yetzer Hara, and their physical bodies were just pure vessels for their neshamos. There was no barrier between the physical and the spiritual. The body itself just radiated holiness. What they were clothed in were garments of light. So their physical form was like a garment for their neshama, fully transparent to the divine light. This structure is hinted at or displayed to some degree when Moshe Rabbeinu comes down from the heavens and his face is glowing and emanating such light from his neshama that he has to wear a mask in order to communicate with Klei Yisrael. But this, of course, all changed for Adam and Chaya after the sin, because there was this change in their awareness of physicality, and they now saw their bodies as independent beings from Hashem's will. And this caused them to feel exposed, and their bodies were no longer purely expressing holiness. And this created a need for Hashem to provide them garments. And it talks about Hashem gave them leather garments, but the deeper meaning is he gave them garments of skin. Because what is our skin? It's leather. It's leather clothing is really all it is. And if you look at the word for light, which is or, it's actually the same word for skin. It's just or for light is aleph vav resh, and for skin, it's ayin vav resh. So it was that small change, that disconnection from Hashem, that changed their garments of light to garments of skin. Or, meaning light, begins with an aleph, and the word for or that means skin begins with an ayin. So if you look at the letter aleph and the shape of it, it's basically a yud on the top separated by a vav that's laid diagonally, and then a yud underneath. So the yud represents on the higher side the divine world, the spiritual world, Hashem, and the yud on the bottom represents the physical world. And the vav, always when you look at how it is used, it's a connector. So basically the letter aleph represents the perfect harmony and connection between the spiritual and physical realms. But after the sin, the or, light, became or, skin, and was replaced with the ayin. And unlike the aleph, where the two yuds are perfectly balanced, the ayin has a crooked structure. It symbolized how the world after the sin became imbalanced, became more focused on materialism and ego. The ayin represents the concealment of divine light. The switch from the aleph to the ayin represents a shift from a world of pure divine revelation to one of physical limitations. And this is why during Havdalah, when we say the bracha over the light, the candle, we hold our fingernails up to the candle. This is why we do that. It is to remind us that that original light, there are remnants of it within us. And that clothing we had is more akin to the fingernails. They're transparent. The Arizal says that the fingernails are made of material very similar to the garments of light. And since nails continuously grow, they represent a connection to the pre-sin state, a part of the body that retains an element of endurance and spiritual radiance. So when we hold our nails to the Havdalah candle, we reflect on that loss of that divine light while acknowledging that trace still exists within us. And we do this on Havdalah because Shabbos is a taste of the world before the sin, when we were at that spiritual elevation. And as we leave Shabbos and re-enter the mundane world, we look at our nails to remind us of the lost garments of light in the spiritual level we are meant to restore. This is our purpose during the week, is to get us back to this status of Adam and Chaya before the sin. The Abdallah candle represents divine light, and when we hold our fingernails to it, we symbolically connect to that original glow. So in the Torah, clothing represents spiritual status, divine favor, test, divine missions. Everything about clothing, of course, there's a purpose. If your question is dead on. If it's mentioned in the Torah, it's there to convey wisdom to us. So regarding Yaakov giving Yosef the coat of many colors, this was a special garment that signified favoritism. The Hebrew word pasim is spelled Pei Samik Yud Mem. And Rashi says something very fascinating, that it's actually an acronym for all of Yosef's future trials. Pei stands for Potiphar. The Samik stands for Socherim, which means the merchants, those that would take him into Egypt. The Yud stands for Yishmaelim, which the Ishmaelites, and the Mem stands for the Midyanim, the Midianites, which were the two different distinct groups that the Torah describes that took Yosef and sold him into Egypt. There's a Midrash that suggests that Yosef's coat was not just a physical garment, but carried historical and spiritual significance, connecting back to Adam's original garments, suggesting it was passed down as a sign of divine favor, Cain and Hevel's rivalry, hinting at the danger of favoritism, and Esau's stolen blessing, showing how clothing plays a role in identity and deception. So the Midrash states that the coat foreshadowed Joseph's future rise and suffering. Another commentator, Rabbi Ovadia ben Yaakov Seforno, who lived in the late 1400s, early 1500s, said that Joseph's garment was a sign of his leadership, his spiritual superiority, that Yaakov had chosen Yosef as an intellectual heir, teaching him all he had learned from Shem and Ever, who, if those names are not familiar, they are the ones that had a yeshiva that were teaching Torah before Mount Sinai, that all our forefathers went to. Shem was one of the three sons of Noach, and Ever was Shem's great-grandson. So next is Esau in Nimrod's coat. So Nimrod was the ruler during the times of Avraham. You may be familiar with the famous Midrash about Nimrod throwing Avraham into a furnace and Hashem protecting Avraham and him not being burnt alive in the furnace. So Nimrod had this coat, and this coat originally belonged to Adam. And after Adam's sin, the coat was passed down through his descendants and eventually came into the possession of Noach. Noach gave it to his son Shem, who passed it down until it came into the hands of Nimrod. And the Midrash states that Nimrod was described as a mighty hunter before Hashem. He derived his strength and his kingship from this coat. When he wore it, animals would submit to him, and people saw him as a very powerful ruler, which helped him establish his kingdom and rebel against Hashem. And in the Torah, when it talks about Esau coming home hungry and asking Yaakov to give him some of that red stuff, and he sold his birthright, and Esau was exhausted. One of the things he was out doing that day was he actually killed Nimrod, and he took the coat for himself. And when the Torah says that Yaakov later wore Esau's special garments, many commentaries say this was the same garment, this coat that originally belonged to Adam. So this coat, represented dominion over the world. Nimrod used it to establish his rule and lead people in rebellion against Hashem. And of course, Nimrod's nemesis was Avraham. And then it gets passed to Esau, whose nemesis was his brother Yaakov, representing this struggle between good and evil over these generations. And eventually coming into the hands of Yaakov, signifying the transfer of divine authority. And regarding David and Shaul's robe, when Shaul was chasing David and was hiding in the cave, and David secretly cut the corner of Shaul's robe, commentators say this act symbolized that David one day replaced Shaul as king. And the Roddick explains that cutting the robe was an unintentional prophecy. Just as David had cut the garment, Shaul's kingship would be cut away from him. And then David felt really guilty because even though Shaul was wrong, he was still Hashem's anointed king. And the commentators say this teaches a very powerful lesson about respecting leadership even when one disagrees. And this is very interesting. In his old age, David HaMelech suffered from constant cold, and he could not warm himself. And the Midrash connects this back to his earlier act of cutting Shaul's robe. Since he disrespected a royal garment, he was punished by never feeling warm again. And this teaches that clothing represents status and dignity, and mistreating it has real consequences. The moral says that clothing in Torah represents spiritual status, divine favor, that Yosef's coat was not just material, it reflected his unique destiny. As you can see from all these stories, to sort of sum all this up, going all the way back to Adam and Chaya, that the original garments we had were just garments of light. And that turned into garments of skin that needed additional clothing. And that was a reflection of a decline in our spiritual status. So all these stories convey how these garments represented and conveyed power or strength or kingship. So the clothing is clearly, as you obviously suspected, Arnold, is representative. That clothing, when mentioned in the Torah, is always representing and teaching other much deeper truths.
Dan, I want your listeners to know that studying Torah is like lifting weights to make your muscles pumped up and big. If you don't make set times each day to learn Torah, then the neshama will have little flabby, girly man muscles. And you don't want your neshama to be weak like a little girl.
Thank you so much, Arnold. That is great advice. Okay, we have time for one more question.
Hello, Dan. This is Dwayne Johnson. Great work with the podcast. My question is, why did Yaakov give Yosef preferential treatment with a special coat? And what can we learn about his actions from a parenting and Torah perspective?
Thank you, Dwayne. A lot of what we covered already regarding clothing answered a lot of this question. So we'll focus on the parenting lessons. So the Torah says, now Yisrael loved Yosef more than all his sons, since he was a child of his old age, and he made him a fine woolen tunic. And then what happened next? Next verse is, his brothers saw that it was he whom their father loved most of all his brothers, so they hated him, and they could not speak to him peaceably. So the Midrash states that, and warns that a person should never treat one child differently from the others, for because of 2 salim of fine wool that Yaakov gave Yosef more than his brothers, they became jealous, and this led to our ancestors' descent to Egypt. And this suggests that favoritism can have long-term consequences beyond the immediate family dynamic. Rambam strongly criticizes Yaakov's decision, saying he should have foreseen the jealousy this would cause. He suggests that Yaakov, having suffered from Esau's jealousy, should have known better than to make one son stand out over the others. However, the Sephorno defends Yaakov, saying he saw unique potential in Yosef and was training him for leadership. With the parenting lessons being every child has unique strengths, a parent's job is to cultivate those strengths without making other children feel less valued. If one child is particularly gifted, parents should encourage their growth while ensuring that others do not feel overlooked. So the story of Yaakov and Yosef is a timeless lesson in parenting. Favoritism, even with good intentions, can create deep family divisions. The Torah warns us to be careful in how we express love, ensuring every child feels valued. At the same time, even parenting mistakes can be a part of a bigger divine plan, which obviously occurred. But our role as parents is to raise each child according to their strength with fairness, wisdom, and foresight. Thank you so much for that question. And I want to thank all of you in the Shema podcast for the Perplexed WhatsApp community for submitting these great questions. I appreciate having the opportunity to research them and learn, and hopefully, God willing, I answer them in full. And as always, I appreciate your listenership.
Dan, I would like to strongly recommend to your listeners to click on the link in the show notes to join the Shema podcast for the Perplexed WhatsApp group. It's an absolute privilege for me to be a part of it, and everyone's insightful and inspirational posts has had a profound impact on my life.
I would like to add that I would really appreciate it if everyone would please remember to rate and share the podcast. Dan's World Rankings continually get stronger, and I would personally like to see that trend continue for him. Thanks.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting Torch so they can continue to spread Torah wisdom to the world by making a donation at torchweb.org and clicking donate in the top right corner of the page.